Whether you use a track saw or a basic circular saw, quite often you'll want to cut a number of pieces of wood to exactly the same length. Not just millimetre perfect, but tenth of a millimetre perfect. So today I'm going to show you how to make a really basic jig that anyone can make, so you can copy the length of a piece of timber time and time again absolutely perfectly with no MFT table, nothing that's going to cost you other than a bit of scrap timber. The deluxe version of this jig has 2 bits of wood in it. The basic version of this jig has 1 piece of wood, and if you're a track saw owner, I guarantee you, you don't even need a jig. Whether you use a track saw or, like I have for many years, a bog standard circular saw, it's not long before you find that you want to make a number of the same length cuts. Nearly every build that you come across has items of exactly the same length, a bit like the same length sides on the cabinet I made last week, or a number of exactly the same width shelves, or 101 other components in all kinds of builds you can think of. So to cut 2 pieces of sheet material to exactly the same length, I mean exactly within tenths of a millimetre to the same length, is a really common thing to do for carpenters and DIYers alike in most of the projects we ever tackle. Now, with other types of saws, there's ways you can do this, a bit like using a stop block with a miter saw. If you need a number of components exactly the same length, it's just to set up a stop block, and it means that each one is the same length without measuring, and it's just repeatable, and it can be done really quickly. But can we use the same sort of stop block arrangement for a circular saw or a track saw? Well, you can, but you're going to need some extra kit. And the one thing that comes to mind is an MFT table. Now, an MFT table is one of those tables where the top has got lots and lots of holes in it. And in those holes, you can put stops or dogs, which means you can line up your track against those in exactly the same position time and time again. The other way you can do it with a track is to have a hinge that lifts up and it goes back down to exactly the same position. But that doesn't work for a normal circular saw. And even if you've got a track saw, do you really want the extra expense of buying all this stuff and also somewhere to put it in the garage in amongst all the other stuff you've bought? So wouldn't it be nice to find a way that you can do this and make repeatable cuts just by making a simple jig and not having all of this expense? And there is a way to do it. So let's get on and make this little jig. And what I've set up here is I've got my cutting board and I've got a nice straight edge, which I know is true and straight in both directions, in this direction and in this direction. I've just screwed it down, but you could clamp it. I normally clamp this to the cutting board. And if you don't know what a jig is essentially something that you make to help you make repeatable something, either cuts or drill holes or shapes and sizes. It's a bit like a template, slightly different. However, this jig sounds a bit fancy, but all it is really is a spacer. So rather than calling it a jig, you could actually just call it a spacer. The first one I'm going to make is for 18mm ply. It's probably best that you make it out of the material you're going to be cutting, and I'll show you why later. So the first thing we do is I've got a nice straight edge on my ply on this edge, and all I'm going to do is just line it up with my straight edge and make sure that it's nice and tight in there, which it is. Then I'm going to get my track for my track saw. I don't think I need a double one, I think I'll get away with just one, and make sure that everything, both the track and the ply, is touching nice and tight up against this straight edge. So everything is nice and tight. I'm now going to clamp that down. And all I need to do is to make that cut. And what I've ended up with is a piece of 18mm 3/4 inch ply, which is exactly the same width as the track that I'm using, between the straight edge on one side and where I've cut off the splinter guard on the other, which suits my track and my saw and the whole setup. So this only suits the saw that you have and the saw that you're using. And that is it. That is the jig made. I told you it wasn't that tricky and anyone can do it. As long as you can cut a piece of sheet material exactly the same width as your track, you've made your jig. That's why I was calling it a spacer. It's no more than that. But how does this work? Well, come back down to the cutting board and I'll show you. Before I do it any more, I'm just going to name this spacer so I don't cut it up for bits and pieces in the future, and I'm going to call it 18mm track. Hopefully that way I won't use it for something completely different in the future. So that goes against my straight edge nice and tight. And next on is the piece I want to cut, and this is why it's handy to have your spacer the same thickness as the piece you're working on, just to make it nice and flat. But that's all nice and tight up against this straight edge with hardly anything there at all. And next comes the piece I want to replicate. Let's say I've already cut this as a shelf or something. I mean, it could be 18mm ply, this is 12mm MDF, it doesn't really matter. But I want to replicate this onto here. So what I do is then put that tight up against the straight edge. And then lastly comes my track. Now, if you look at the end here, you may already be able to work out what's going to happen before I make this cut. Let's freeze this frame and I'll talk you through it. Because of the way I've just made it, the space that I've just cut here in blue is exactly the same width as my track. So when I cut through my workpiece along the edge of the track, the width of the new piece here has to be exactly the same as the piece I want to replicate on the top. Because by definition, both the top and the bottom layers here have to be the same total width. So let's see what we've got once I take the clamp off. I'm just looking at the end shot. This is the piece I want to replicate. This is a piece I've just cut. Put one on top of the other. And spookily enough, they are absolutely exact to the 10th of a millimetre. That looks pretty good to me. And one of the great things about using this is you don't have to worry about the curve of the blade or any of that sort of stuff, because everything's off to the left, so the curve of the blade just doesn't come into it. It just makes it exact over and over again, completely repeatable without having to even measure. I don't even know what that distance is. Let's just finish off this piece by cutting it in the other direction. So all I'm going to do is spin it around this way and do exactly the same thing. I found with this method that as long as you can get a good square bearing on the straight edge, then whether your workpiece is orientated one way or the other doesn't really matter. So it's easy to cut long ways or across the short edge. To keep the track in place, I just use a clamp on the underside of it, on the near side of me, and make sure that when I'm doing the cut, I also put a bit of sideways pressure on the saw, pushing it in to keep it tight against the spacer. So now I have a shelf or a piece of sheet material or whatever you want to call it, exactly the same in both directions. And I wish you could feel that, but I can't feel any difference in each direction. So both of these pieces are exactly the same. And it also works, obviously, for any thickness material, just like when I was cutting some 6mm MDF in the last video. You might not have spotted it, but I did use this method last time when I was cutting the 6mm MDF and I needed a number of strips all exactly the same width. So I first cut my 6mm track spacer, and with this in place I could then do a number of repeat cuts really quickly without any measuring, which all came out exactly the same and worked really quite well. And as well as standard sort of width cuts, the sort of thing that you find in most projects, you can even use it for really thin cuts. Let's try one of those. So I've got a piece of MDF here, which on its side is around 12mm, although it's obviously not 12mm, but that's another story. If I put that in there, although it's a bit wobbly, I put that tight up against there, and then put my workpiece back into place, once again tight up against my spacer. Then with this right tight up against here, or just under there, I should be cutting a 12mm strip. So there's my piece that I've just cut, And this is my spacer, which I've just used, which means that both of those are exactly the same width. If you really want to enhance a jig like this, all you need to do is to screw a nice square stop end on the end of it, which means you can then do without the stop on your cutting board, just making everything a little bit easier. This is what I called at the start the enhanced version. Having said that, it's just 2 bits of wood glued and screwed together. So with that glued onto the back of the track, then I don't really need this stop block. It all works just as long as everything is nice and square, but that's not that difficult to achieve on a piece of ply like this. Right, that's the track saw. Let's have a look at the circular saw. And I would normally, with my circular saw, use a bit of a track like this that I made many years ago out of a piece of MDF and a piece of 12mm ply glued and screwed onto it. I then cut both of these sides using the saw that it was designed for. So this works on this side and this works on this side exactly because these sides have been cut by my saw. So for the circular saw, we could make an exactly the same type of track as the track saw based around this, but not everyone has this and you don't necessarily need it. So let's make a little bit of a jig in the same lines, but without even a track. And for this, I'm just going to be using another piece of 18mm 3/4 inch ply, but it could be MDF, it could be 12mm, 6mm, it could be melamine, it can be any material that you're using for the project. This time I'm not using a track, I'm just running the base plate of the saw tight up along the straight edge. Oh. Hey. I remember why I don't like using this circular saw in the workshop so much these days. It hasn't got any dust distraction, no dust port at all. So this time our jig, because we're using this very narrow side of the circular saw, is very narrow. I'm just going to clean that up a little bit. And that's all we need. So if I put that between the straight edge and the piece I want to replicate, it should work. Exactement. And lastly, at the very start of this video, I made a very bold statement saying that if you use a track saw, then you've probably got something that you can use as a jig without even having to make one. You see, the jigs that I've made today have been the same width as a track. So most track saw owners will have a second piece of track. Using a proper piece of track that you've already cut to suit your saw will be by definition the most accurate jig that you can use, as long as the workpiece is tight against the splinter guard rather than the aluminium track, and you're using a similar thickness material as your track. You can use materials much thicker than this, but you might need to pack out your spacer because, to be accurate, both layers really need to be parallel to each other. Oh, that is really accurate. There's no way I can get it any more accurate than that. It's so satisfying finding a method that just works as you hope it would and is accurate without any measuring. If I had to cut another 10 of those now, it would literally just take me a couple of minutes and they would all be exactly bang on. So really good way of doing that. I hope you've enjoyed this video and maybe you've learned something along the way that you can put in place in your next project. I will see you next time.